Imagine for a second being born into one of the world's absolute most famous families, but knowing with near absolute certainty that you are never ever meant to rule. You're spending your early years in this quiet townhouse in Mayfair, standing third in line to the throne. And normally that position guarantees a life of relative privacy, a life shielded from the heavy burden of the crown. But, as we know, history had a completely different plan. So welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into the incredibly unlikely journey of Elizabeth II and looking at how she went from being a minor royal to literally the most widely traveled head of state in all of human history.
To really wrap our heads around this journey, there are three incredible puzzles we need to look at. First, how on earth did a princess become queen while sitting in a Kenyan treehouse? Second, how did someone born as a minor royal end up as Britain's longest reigning monarch? And third, how did she manage to hold the deepest secrets of 14 different prime ministers? We're going to unpack exactly how she pulled this off, starting from the very moment her life was turned completely upside down.
Part 1. The Reluctant Heir. From third in line to next in line.
Okay, we have to start right at the beginning. Princess Elizabeth was born at 2:40 a.m. on April 21, 1926. And at the time, her family truly didn't expect her to ever sit on the throne. But then, a single family decision in December 1936 changed literally everything. Her uncle, King Edward VIII, suddenly abdicated the throne to Mary Wallace Simpson. In an instant, her father became King George VI, and 10-year-old Elizabeth became the heir presumptive. Now, this is a fascinating constitutional quirk. Being heir presumptive meant her destiny to rule still wasn't totally guaranteed, because under the laws at the time, a son's right to the throne displaced the daughter's. So if her parents had miraculously had a baby boy later on, Elizabeth would have been bumped right down the line. But as the presumptive heir, her entire education immediately shifted. Suddenly, she's studying constitutional history and law, preparing for a monumental job she never even asked for.
When you look at this timeline, it's wild to see how fast she was pulled out of the shadows. In just over 2 decades, she goes from a quiet birth in Mayfair to preparing for the weight of an entire empire. But before she could wear the crown, she had to prove what she was made of during one of the absolute darkest periods of the 20th century.
Part 2. A Princess at War. The Making of an Auto Mechanic.
So, when the Second World War broke out, Elizabeth didn't just hide away or flee the country. She was only 13, but she and her sister Margaret stayed at Windsor Castle, participating in air raid drills and living under the exact same food rationing as the rest of the British public. And this quote from her mother perfectly captures that gritty, wartime solidarity the royal family built. Even when Buckingham Palace was hit by bombs in 1940, her parents refused to leave. The young princess completely absorbed that lesson of resilience. She was incredibly active, too. She was a Girl Guide, a Sea Ranger, and in 1944, she even won a carriage driving class at the Royal Windsor Horse Show. This period really forged the unassuming virtues that would define her entire reign.
And she certainly wasn't just a figurehead to boost morale. When she turned 18, she insisted on actively serving. In 1945, she joined the women's branch of the British Army. She literally took a vehicle maintenance course and got her hands dirty diagnosing faulty engines, becoming the first female royal to be an active-duty member of the armed forces. The press absolutely loved it, dubbing her Princess Auto Mechanic.
Part 3. Ascension in the Trees. The Treetops Transition.
Now this brings us to what has to be the most dramatic, cinematic moment of her entire life. It's 1952, and Elizabeth takes her ailing father's place on a major Commonwealth tour. On February 6th, she is thousands of miles away, staying at the remote Treetops Hotel in Kenya. It was there that she received the completely devastating news that her father had passed away. Think about that for a second. In a heartbeat, without any ceremony, the massive machinery of the monarchy shifted. She literally climbed into that treehouse as a princess and descended as Queen Elizabeth II. She immediately flew back to London, where she was greeted right on the tarmac by her very first Prime Minister, Winston Churchill.
Part 4. Mastering Soft Power. The Art of Ruling Without Governing. So here's a big question. How does a constitutional monarch actually rule when all the true hard political power rests with Parliament? Well, her power was all about unparalleled influence and what we call soft power. Just look at this number, 14. That is the staggering number of prime ministers she held confidential audiences with behind closed doors, stretching all the way from Winston Churchill to Boris Johnson.
Over decades, she built up an institutional memory that no elected politician could ever hope to match. Tony Blair hit the nail on the head here when he talked about how shrewd and perceptive she was. Actually, there's this amazing story where she met Tony Blair and she famously reminded him of her vast experience by saying, "You are my 10th prime minister. The first was Winston. That was before you were born." I mean, wow. Talk about putting things into perspective. And her mastery of soft power went well beyond closed-door meetings. She was completely fluent in French. This was a huge deal because it meant she could speak directly to leaders in places like France and Canada, entirely without a translator. It's a brilliant diplomatic tool. By speaking their language, she built immediate personal trust on the global stage.
Part 5. The Passportless Traveler, a mind-bending constitutional quirk.
Over her 70-year reign, she visited a mind-blowing 117 countries. She was doing hundreds of state visits, touching down in China, Russia, the United States, you name it. It officially made her the most widely traveled head of state in the history of the world.
But here is the craziest part about all that travel. Despite crossing all those borders, the Queen did not possess a British passport. Not a single one. Why? Because legally, all British passports were issued in her name. They literally say the Secretary of State requests free passage in the name of His or Her Majesty. So it was entirely unnecessary for her to carry one. She was quite literally her own authorization to travel the world, the only person in the entire UK who could do that.
Part 6. The Final Plan. Operation London Bridge.
Now, an institution that relies on stability just cannot afford uncertainty, right? So after decades of quiet continuity, the end of her era was the most highly calculated and orchestrated event in British history. The government had been preparing for it since 1960 under the codename Operation London Bridge. It was a strict minute-by-minute protocol that began the moment the secret phrase, "London Bridge is down," was spoken. And because she passed away at Balmoral Castle in Scotland, a specific supporting plan called Operation Unicorn was instantly triggered to manage her journey back to London. At the exact same time, Operation Springtide managed the immediate ascension of King Charles. Every single detail was mapped out to ensure unshakable continuity.
Part 7. Conclusion. A promise kept.
When you contrast her totally unexpected ascension with the deeply, deeply planned end of her life, you really uncover the true legacy of her reign. It all goes back to a promise she made in 1947, on her 21st birthday. Broadcasting from South Africa, she pledged that her whole life, whether it be long or short, would be devoted to service. And she faithfully kept that exact promise for 7 decades, standing as this massive beacon of continuity through an era of unbelievable global change.
As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with these final puzzles to think about. How did a young girl, never born to be the heir, end up as Britain's longest-reigning monarch? How did a princess wake up in the trees of Kenya and become queen before she even made it home? And how did she hold the absolute deepest secrets of 14 prime ministers while remaining a symbol of impartiality for the world? It really shows us that sometimes the most enduring power isn't loud or demanding. It's just consistent, dedicated, and quietly steadfast. Thanks so much for joining me today, and I hope you keep exploring the fascinating histories that shape our world.